we're going to turn to David Hume. David Hume lived after Pascal. Pascal's dates 1623 to 1669. David Hume's dates 1711 to 1776. Dies the year of the American Revolution, something he did not live to see, but something that he influenced through some of his ideas. His background, he was a man of the Enlightenment. Okay, the Enlightenment is a period of time in the history of the West when several characteristic intellectual features occurred. And you can think of this time period in your history memory bank as happening from maybe about 1680 or even 1700. I'll just put here 1700. Until about 1800. So it's about a 100-year time period. And during this time, science is really, really big. The sciences seem to be delivering extraordinary knowledge. Stuff that was a mystery, had been a mystery. I think I misspelled that. Okay, stuff that had been a mystery for centuries, for millennia. And science is suddenly able to deliver this. At the same time, certain other things are occurring. So, for instance, colonialism is occurring. This is becoming the dominant theme throughout the world. Everybody know what colonialism is, yes? It was a system by which especially Europeans sought to colonize much or most of the world. Okay, and they started in the New World, the Americas, and from there branched out to other parts of the globe. Okay, and actually, David Hume, you'll find in some of his writings some pretty characteristic xenophobic style colonialist statements. Although he is kind of a progressive for his time, still he advocates the colonialist system and sees other peoples, non-Europeans, as being barbarians. So he's kind of a xenophobic personage in that regard. Okay. So Christianity generally declines during this period. I say generally because it's not clear what's happening in the majority of the intellectual centers sometimes in the West. The people who are read in this course, like for instance Hume and Nietzsche, are seen as anti-Christian thinkers. But there are also during the time period a lot of pro-Christian thinkers. So faithful Christians who generally think rigorously about fundamental issues. So I say generally just to qualify that and say among some quarters it is declining, but among others it is not. Okay, colonialism, science, Christianity, other things are happening too, like population is exploding, for instance, because there are health advances that are occurring. Okay, so whereas the population of David Hume's home, he's from Scotland, the British Isles in the 1700s start out with a population of about 5 million, and by the end, the population is around 30 million. By the end of the Enlightenment, it's around 30 million. It's because of advances in medicine, and they're starting to think about the possibility that infectious diseases occur, things like that. Okay, so there's some other characteristics of this time period as well. David Hume himself was Scottish. Okay, he may have been an atheist, we're not sure. He was always coy about that topic. He certainly was not a friend of Christianity, and he's really the first thinker since the ancient era. So since Plato and Aristotle, since that time period, who could be said to have been hostile to Christianity. Other characteristics about Hume. Hume was seen as an incredibly dangerous thinker in his time period. Okay, I was talking a minute ago about people who don't conform to the dominant beliefs of the society. He did not, and was seen as an incredibly dangerous thinker as a result, and was refused all sorts of academic positions, refused all sorts of honors, and although he was not destitute, he always found a way to support himself. Nevertheless, during his lifetime, he was kind of an outcast, kind of a social outcast. Okay, let me see, other things about him. He is partly a social outcast because he calls science into question. Okay, so yes, he is hostile to Christian thought in certain ways, but he also calls science into question. And by that I mean that we're going to find this out in the next couple or 3 class sessions. He says things that make people think that maybe science isn't capable of delivering certain knowledge, and this really freaks people out. The idea that science could be a fiction or just made up, the idea that some of the deliverances of science are not as certain as people had hoped they would be, this really freaks people out. And for that reason also, he's kind of a social outcast. A couple of other things about him. He was a lifelong bachelor. In fact, a whole bunch of the thinkers in our canon this semester were all lifelong bachelors. Nietzsche never marries, Pascal never marries, Descartes never marries, although he fathered a bunch of children. Hume never marries. Wow, that's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about that before. Aristotle marries. Maybe it's the angst of being a lifelong single person that makes these people think great thoughts and write great texts. Because if you become married, right, you're satisfied with life. You don't try to challenge the status quo, and you don't, you're not so anxious that you're driven to do rock the boat style activities. So maybe that's what's going on. Guys, I apologize. I wish we could read a woman philosopher in this class, but there are none in the canon up until the last 50 years or so. Really, it's the last 50 or 70 years, where, especially starting with Hannah Arendt and Elizabeth Anscombe and other 20th century philosophers, names you might not even know, but there just isn't anybody prior to that time. Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century is kind of a minor thinker, but so alongside these people being bachelors, they also aren't women, so I apologize for that, but there's not really much. If you're doing a historical course where you do a survey of the history of philosophy, there just really isn't anybody. Hume was a man who had many friends. Although he was a social outcast, he had many personal friends. He loved food, loved drink, was incredibly fat. Okay, I could show you guys a picture of him. I wish I could. I can only show PowerPoints right now, so unfortunately I can't show you guys an open internet picture. Google him yourself. He's like 350 pounds. Okay, one day, actually, here's an anecdote about him. One day he spent the evening like he often did at the pub with his friends in Edinburgh in Scotland and was headed home. Scotland is a very foggy, marshy place, especially in the evenings. It can be really wet. And apparently he lost his way and fell into a marsh. And he was so fat he couldn't pull himself out. And it's like 3 a.m. as the anecdote goes. And this woman came along the path, and he waved and said, "Help, help, help, I'm over here, I need help." And she said, "Who is it? Who is over there?" He says, "It's David Hume. Can someone help me? I'm stuck in the marsh." She turned away and she said, "I don't help atheists." So that's probably not a good way to represent your Christianity. Okay, but it is an anecdote that captures the spirit of the times. Hume was seen as a dangerous thinker who definitely did rock the boat substantially. Any questions about his background or about the Enlightenment era, the life and times of this famous thinker, before I say a couple things about some of his actual ideas? Everybody good? Had anybody heard of David Hume before this class? Okay, well now you have. Let's talk a little bit about some background concepts so that we can understand why he's seen as such a dangerous thinker, or was at the time. Now he's just seen as like a classical era thinker, but at the time he was seen as very dangerous. Okay, so let's talk about some background concepts. If you take some different sentences, just standard level sentences, Hume says these sentences have different structures or different characteristics. Okay, so I'm actually getting into a second point now, and I'm talking about sentence structure. Okay, for instance, it is raining in Houston today. Period. Okay, first of all, is this sentence true? Sentence is false, right? It is not raining in Houston today. It is a sentence whose truth you can verify by reference to another state of affairs that is outside of the sentence itself. Okay, you can ascertain whether or not this sentence is correct by checking its correspondence to a reality that is beyond it. Let me put another sentence out there. 8 and 8 is 16. This is also a sentence that's making a truth assertion, just like the sentence, it is raining in Houston today. Only this is a sentence whose truth assertion you can ascertain without referencing a state of affairs that is outside of the sentence itself. In other words, you can determine whether or not this sentence is true by virtue of an inspection of just the sentence. Just as you have to look outside this sentence to determine whether it's true, so also you can look just within this sentence to identify whether it is true or not. Okay, here's another one. All professors are crazy. And by crazy, read into it what you will. Eccentric, bizarre. Who knows what they do in their spare time? Here's a hint. It's pretty conventional. Okay. This is a sentence whose truth can be ascertained how? By reference to the sentence itself or by reference to an external state of affairs? It requires an external state of affairs, does it not? That's correct. Okay, all bachelors are unmarried. Is this a sentence whose truth requires an inspection of an external state of affairs, or can it be ascertained by looking at just the sentence itself? All bachelors are unmarried. It's an internally true sentence, isn't it? Does not require reference to an external state of affairs. Okay, does everybody see that that's the case? Because the truth of the object of the sentence, namely that bachelors are unmarried, is something that is actually contained in the subject of the sentence. Bachelors. It is part of the definition of bachelors that they are unmarried. So the truth of the assertion can be identified by virtue of just the sentence itself. Now, all this is famously called Hume's fork. And the fork is just this. Some of the things that human beings think and say require reference to an empirical situation or an empirical reality, whereas other things that human beings think and say are true as such, apart from the empirical reality. It's a fork. Some are one way, other things are another way. And math and geometry and logic and a few thoughts whose definitions are actually contained in their subjects, like this sentence, all bachelors are unmarried. These kinds of things, Hume calls them relations of ideas. Okay, they are relations of ideas. They are relations of ideas because their truth, their correctness, their legitimacy as ideas is something that can be ascertained by looking at just them themselves and their internal relations. Again, one more pass. Relations of ideas are things like 8 and 8 is 16 or all bachelors are unmarried because these are sentences that are internally true. They are the case by reference just to their internal realities. Okay, alternatively, the other side of the fork is a different kind of thought. Most thoughts for Hume are actually not relations of ideas. Most human thoughts are matters of fact. Matters of fact are different from relations of ideas because matters of fact are only true by verification with reference to an external world. You look at the facts to determine whether they are the case. So Hume calls them matters of fact. And Hume says it is a mistake to predicate of one kind of thought, like a relation of ideas, the characteristics that are the case for another kind of thought, like a matter of fact. It is a mistake to predicate of matters of fact, vice versa, characteristics that are true of relations of ideas. In other words, if there are certain things that are the case for relations of ideas, you can't say that they are also the case necessarily for matters of fact, and vice versa. Now, so far, none of this seems controversial. And so far, it's not. And most of his contemporaries would have agreed that so far this is okay. But he's going to take it in a direction that struck people at the time as being really controversial and made him into one of the great bogeymen of history, of intellectual history. He was seen as a very dangerous thinker whose works were banned and burned for a long time because it was thought that if his thoughts got out and became widespread, then the very fundamentals of the sciences would be shaken. Okay? Are there any questions about this distinction, the Hume's fork distinction between these two different kinds of thinking and speaking? The relations of ideas and the matters of fact. Everybody get that? Kind of get it at least? Cool. Okay, be on the